the steps that we're going to be going over this week, which are EQs, or evaluation questions, and evaluation designs. Now, this has a very much a lot to do with the purposes of the evaluation. So that's really what we're talking about, again, are purposes, designs, and evaluation questions. So the text actually has a couple of really good typologies that lay out the key ideas of these two chapters pretty well. So I just wanted to draw your attention to them. I don't have the pages here, but it's box 8.1, which goes over the evaluation purposes and types, and really just pulls it all together to see that these basic different types: to gain insights or to determine necessary inputs, to find areas in need of improvement or change, to assess program effectiveness, and to address issues of human rights and social justice. So those different purposes then map onto the different types of evaluation. And like any typology, there's always room for flexibility. For instance, Mertens and Wilson have capacity building along with the first purpose, the gaining insight and determining necessary inputs. And I see how that makes sense, but also partly because I am a strong proponent of capacity building, I think it has a place in all of the other purposes as well. And then this other box in Chapter 9, which really presents quite clearly the different branches and how they fit into the different types of evaluation. So this is a good sort of go-to flashcard with, if you feel like the reading is all over the place, you can go to these boxes and kind of get a summary of what's going on. And I think one important thing about this is that it just reminds us that evaluation is not just surveys, and it is not just to find out if the program is effective. There are all of these other designs or types of data collection approaches, and there are all these types of evaluation, from context evaluation through participatory evaluation to deliberative democratic evaluation and critical race theory and indigenous evaluation, all sorts of types. So let's remember that the tent is very large. So now we're going to really focus on getting to evaluation questions, getting to good questions. There are a number of things that you should always keep in mind. One of them, which I'm not going to talk about now, is stakeholders. So remember, you all did your stakeholder analysis. We don't just put that in a drawer and forget about it. As you think about what is the purpose of your evaluation, what is it all about? How is it going to matter? How is it going to make a difference? And what do you need to find out about? Your stakeholders are extremely important, so keep them in mind. Another important piece is what I refer to as life cycle analysis. So just like a person, a program grows and develops over time. So they don't stay the same generally. Maybe you know of a program that has been the same year after year for decades. But it's important to remember that this programmatic development or growth over time is actually non-linear. A program might develop for a year, but then the program implementers might realize that, oh, we really, maybe our recruitment isn't quite right. We're not getting the people in the door that we need to. So let's double back and reconsider how we get the message out about our program. And that this is not anchored in chronological time. So just because your program is 30 years old does not mean that it's grown up to be a grandfather program already. It still might be stuck in its adolescent stage. Then the second point is heterogeneity, or difference in the timing and development of program elements. So you might be using a curriculum that the educators who were in your role before you had come up with or even gotten from another program or another state, but you are new in your role and you're implementing this curriculum. So does that count as a new program or an old program? Well, in a sense, it's both. So you have to sort of hold that tension in your mind as you think through, okay, now I know my evaluation has to be matched to my life cycle. It's an old program, but I'm implementing it for the first time or the second time. So it's both old and new. And then just this point that there's an interaction between the program and its environment. And there's also an interaction between the program and its evaluation, and that's something, the state of knowledge about the program also has an influence on how developed the program is or can be. So here, and this I will provide as a handout also within this module, is a little typology of the different phases. So in biomedical research, for instance, if a new pharmaceutical is going to be produced, it has to go through a 4-phase trial, which starts with trials in the laboratory and then moves into studies on animals, and then finally to a study of with a small group of people, and the last stage would be sort of a dissemination study. Well, we think that programs and evaluations develop over the same 4 phases. So, for instance, if you look at a program that's in phase 1, and we divide each phase into 2 subphases. So, phase 1A is a program that is brand new, just being implemented for the first time. It's going to be slightly different each time it's being run. The implementers, the educators might be making rapid changes as they go. That's an early life cycle. All the way down through programs that get more and more stable, down to a program that is fully protocolized and is being widely distributed, maybe across the whole country or across the whole world. So very, very different programs based on their life cycle. And now this is very, very important. The life cycle of the evaluation must be well aligned with the life cycle of the program. So that's why we have it matched up here. So a process and response type of evaluation is most appropriate for programs in the initiation stage. A change evaluation, thinking again back to the purposes laid out by Mertens and Wilson, a change type of evaluation is best focused on the development stage of the program life cycle. The comparison and control life cycle of evaluation is only appropriate, and it becomes appropriate once the program has reached phase 3, a phase of stability. And then finally, the evaluation life cycle focusing on generalizability, or will this program work somewhere else, is a natural fit with the program life cycle about dissemination, sending the program out into other contexts. So these definitions are might not capture all of what your program is, but they're rules of thumb, they're heuristic devices to let us try to get an idea of where our programs are, and in that case, what life cycle of evaluation is most appropriate. Now this picture shows just in another way, shows a little bit about why the alignment between the life cycles is so important. So if you look at program C, for instance, it is at a program life cycle of about 1B. So that means maybe it was offered last year, it's being offered for the second time, but with a new educator, so it's still in a state of flux and adaptation. Maybe the participants who come to the first session are not the same participants who come later because it's a kind of drift in, drift out type of scenario. So it's a 1B life cycle. But you'll notice, as far as evaluation life cycle, it's already all the way up at phase 3A. So this would be something like a pre-post design, where you're gathering a lot of data before the program and then gathering it afterwards. And actually, 3A or 3B is also where we might begin to introduce a control or a comparison group to say, okay, to try to tease out whether the effects that we're seeing, the data that we're seeing, are as a result of the program or just a result of random chance. So in that in order to do a phase 3A evaluation, it actually takes a fair amount of resources, time, money, expertise. Now the problem with it being misaligned is that you might invest in that fairly advanced evaluation, but because the program is still in such a constant state of flux, you don't know if your conclusions are going to be an accurate representation of what's actually going on in the program. You might get a false negative where you find out through your data collection that the program did not have any positive outcomes, and that could be incorrect. It might be a false negative. You find no outcomes, but actually the program is doing something good in the people's lives, or vice versa. Because of just all of the variation and all of the statistical noise that's going on, you might find that there is a difference, but it might be just a flaw in the statistics or in the analysis. That is, that change might have been just random chance causing the difference between the pre and the post scores. Then if you look at program B, you'll notice that it is in the 3A life cycle. So that's a program that's been around. It's been a little bit more standardized. It might be the same, might be offered in the same way time after time. But if you'll notice, its evaluation life cycle is only a 1B. So this is something that happens quite frequently. And it's a program that has developed and developed more and become standardized and been implemented with fidelity, but the evaluation did not grow up with the program. It's like one person grew up and the other stayed behind. So the evaluation of a phase 1B is still looking at things like context and needs and satisfaction. So you might be asking, did you like the food? Or did you like the speaker? And those could be important things to ask, especially for a program that's at a basic life cycle like a 1A or a 1B. But if the program is already developed and evolved into a 3A, it could be having some really significant impacts on people's lives, and you're not even asking about it, because all you're asking about is did they like the food. So that mismatch risks leading to some big errors in your evaluation as well. One reason why program C might come about, the green dot that's above the line, is because sometimes funders or administrators want a particular type of evaluation. They think a more advanced evaluation is always better. Well, if you now are doing an early life cycle program and you want to respond to the funder or the administrator that no, right now what I need to do is a satisfaction survey, is a process evaluation to see is the program being implemented the way we thought it was, then you can use the life cycle argument to try to justify your case. Then finally, you have program A, the red dot, which falls right on the red line. Now that shows that the program has good alignment between the program life cycle and the evaluation life cycle. So in this case, it's a program that's been around for a very, very long time, maybe decades even. But not only that, the program is mature. It's implemented with a great deal of fidelity and consistency. It's implemented with quality, so people know what they're doing. The participants who come in the beginning are also those who are who come to all the sessions, who are there week after week if it's a multi-week program. And you'll see from the evaluation life cycle, it's at a phase 4A as well. So there's alignment, and this would be, if I'm not mistaken, essentially a randomized controlled trial, which oftentimes can be problematic if it's inappropriate, but this might be one case in which it's actually the appropriate method to use, because the program is being run with enough consistency, and it might be having these dramatic influences and impacts on people's lives. And so one of the most rigorous ways to gather data on that and to sort of contradict any counterfactuals or any possible other explanations of what might be going on is to have a pre-post design with a comparison group that is not going to the program. So if you remember from the readings, this is one of the designs that was discussed, and I can talk about it in just a few moments as well. But this is one instance in which it represents a case in which there's a good alignment between the program life cycle and the evaluation life cycle. And so when you sit down to try to revisit the purposes of your evaluation and to come up with some evaluation questions and some evaluation design decisions, you need to keep in mind not just your stakeholders, but also your life cycle alignment. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it is actually a really interesting graphic that shows the ways in which this program and evaluation life cycle question is also connected to the notion of validity. So you probably noticed in the text that there was quite a bit about internal validity and external validity. And if you haven't taken a research methods course, these may have been new terms to you. But in a nutshell, internal validity has to do with, are we measuring what we think we're measuring? So is a survey of youth engagement in science, is it really a good measure? Is it getting us as close as we can to the actual underlying phenomenon of that young person's interest in science? Now, external validity, on the other hand, is about generalizability. Are the findings that we're coming up with here, in this case, are these conclusions that are based in this context, can they be applied to another context as well? So if the program works in one county, does that mean that it might work in another county, or in another state, or in another country, in another continent? So those are questions of external validity. And often people get fixated, especially on internal validity, and then they think a little bit about external validity. But recently within the field of evaluation, there's been a little bit of a push to consider more types of validity, like viable validity, which you see around the entire outside of the circle. And that is essentially having to do with the notion of feasibility. So sure, it might be the highest quality measure possible, but if it's a 80-page survey that you want kids to fill out when they're in the woods after an environmental education program, that's just not viable, that's not feasible. So in fact, it is no longer valid, even if it has high internal validity. So you also see here the direction in which the arrows are pointing, going going clockwise. And the blue arrows outside of the circle about bottom up and top down, this actually touches on not just evaluation, but program planning, which of course, logic models, thinking through all these things, it has just as much to do as with program planning as it does with program evaluation. But programs that start at the initiation life cycle, where an evaluation would be focusing on process and response, they're more concerned with construct validity. So for instance, if a program wants to increase healthy living choices, well, that is a construct. And one of the early evaluation questions might be, what do we mean in this program by healthy living choices? And they're building the program, they're building the evaluation from the ground up. They can start at that phase. But if you look at the other arrow, the top-down arrow, in some contexts, in many community education and extension contexts, there might be a funder who is saying, no, don't develop your own bottom-up program. You take one of these evidence-based programs that is already developed. Now that program would be within the internal validity and external validity realm, where someone has done a study on it already. They believe the program has reached a place of stability and is ready for dissemination. So now it's up to you as the educator to sort of take that curriculum or that program down off the shelf and run it. So that is the top-down vision or version of program planning and program development. But you can see, because all of these circles are nested within each other, that they're all interrelated. So doing that type of top-down programming has implications for what evaluation questions you might want to ask. So finally we get to evaluation questions. Now I really like this metaphor of the hourglass, because if you think back to everything we've done so far, thinking about the different philosophical assumptions that go into even how we conceptualize evaluation. But then once you chose your practicum project, you thought about stakeholders, you thought about boundary analysis, you did a logic model to model the theory of change or the program logic. All of that was going into characterizing or describing the program, and as you did, you kind of were narrowing down, honing in, until you get to some purposes. What is this all about? And then finally, the narrowest section of the hourglass is the evaluation questions. All your work previously on your practicum project is leading up now to your selection of the evaluation questions. And then from there, everything unfolds from there. The hourglass gets wide again on the bottom half. So based on whatever evaluation questions you come up with, there will be significant implications for how you're going to do data collection, how you'll need to manage that data, how you'll analyze the data and interpret it, and eventually even report on it. All of that unfolds from or flows from your decision about evaluation questions. So this is a pretty important moment in the process. At the same time, it doesn't necessarily have to be rocket science. At the end of the day, what an evaluation question really is all about is, what do you want to know about your program? Simple as that. And actually, this is a good moment for me to mention that very often, and I encounter this quite a bit, very often when someone hears the term evaluation question, they start thinking immediately of the questions that are written down on a paper survey that is handed to a participant at the end of an event or the end of a training, or the questions that you ask a participant in an interview or focus group after an activity or an event or a training. Now those are more what I would refer to as data collection items. Those would be items in an interview or items in a survey. But evaluation questions are not what you ask directly of the participant. The evaluation questions are the broader, more overarching questions that guide your entire study. Now you might have one or two or three, or depending on the specificity or the level of detail, you could have even up to 5 evaluation questions. But remember, you're not asking the participants these questions. These are questions that just frame your inquiry, frame your evaluative inquiry. So essentially, these are questions that phrase, what do you want to know about your program? And this is very connected to the second point, which is, what kinds of claims do you want to be able to make about your program or its context? And this then has to do with the key constructs, which is an idea I mentioned previously, and how you would possibly gather evidence on that key construct. The second to last point there is essentially asking the question, how would you know it if you saw it? So if your construct is youth interest in science, and you passed youth interest in science on the sidewalk and it bumped into you, would you know that that was youth interest in science, or would just something else? How would you know it if you saw it? And then once you articulate how you're going to know it, how can you actually systematically gather that evidence? Because that's what makes evaluation, is the systematic inquiry. But all of this really is about what you want to know and what claims you want to make. And although I said it's not rocket science, especially when it comes down to what claims you want to make, you have to be a little careful with the wording of your evaluation questions, because the words you choose for your evaluation question have stark implications for what types of claims you're going to be able to make. And we'll get into this in just a moment with some examples. So for example, you might focus just on an activity. These pictures here are snippets of pathway models, which not all of you got to do, but essentially once you have a logic model, you can turn it into a pathway model by drawing arrows between the different elements. And again, that just shows a little bit more completely the hypothesized associations or linkages between the various elements in the logic model. So using the model, the logic model or the pathway model, thinking about our life cycles, thinking about our stakeholders, you can look at the model and say, what are some important pieces of this program that I might need to shine a light on in terms of doing some more systematic inquiry? Well, it might just be an activity. So the one on the screen here, you see, says series of science discovery workshops. There are some arrows going out of there, so they're hypothesizing that this is connected to something. But you could come up with plenty of questions that don't even get at outcomes, that focus just on the activity. And these might be very valid, very useful, very credible types of questions that could be appropriate given the context of this program and where it is. So for instance, you could ask, to what extent did participants perceive the science workshops as useful? That tells you something. Now, does that allow you to make the claim that your program caused world peace and harmony and saved the county $5 million? No, you can't make those claims based on this question. But what you could claim was the majority of participants reported that this program would be useful to them in their lives. Similarly, looking just at an activity, you can ask some process questions or some implementation questions. You might know or have some assumptions that you've identified that, well, really we can't even begin to question whether or not this program is going to lead to the desired outcomes until we have some data and some interpretation of the quality of the implementation. So is this program being implemented well relative to, say, some assessment of youth program quality or agricultural extension program quality, whatever context you're in? Then even the facilitators' perspectives, their stakeholders too, asking them or having a question by which you will ask them could be a valid way of gathering data. And then, so very often, many organizations have realized that they are not reaching the demographics and the diverse levels of stakeholders that they want to. So if that is the case, then it might not even be time for them to focus on outcomes. They have to get clear first on who they are reaching and how they are reaching them. So all of these focus just on an activity, and they allow you to make certain claims but not other claims. Then if you focus on an outcome, there will be slightly different questions, such as these ones. At the end of the program, what is participants' level of awareness of this topic? At the end of the program, how similar or dissimilar are the participants' awareness levels? So to see if there's different emergent levels of awareness among the different participants. You can get more and more specific as you go. Now this allows you to make other claims. If you gather data in response to the question at the end of the program, what is participants' level of awareness of these topics? If you have that for different topics, you can then report back that after this program, you can't say it was as a result of the program, but you can say that participants who went through the program had these levels of awareness, or in this case it's awareness. It could be knowledge, it could be intent to change a behavior, and you can graph that out. You can do some descriptive statistics to say, okay, now we know that these folks over here have this level of awareness, these folks over here have this level, and those are some claims you can make. Then perhaps what is more common, but not always necessary, is to have evaluation questions, or EQs, which are focused on a relationship between an activity and an outcome, or an outcome and a longer-term outcome. So examples of questions under this type of approach would be, do teens who undergo volunteer training change their level of leadership skills as compared to pre-program levels? So that's a question, that's an evaluation question, which will, if answered with valid data, will allow you to make some claims, perhaps stronger claims as compared to some of those earlier claims from the previous slides, but it also has pretty significant implications for what you need to do in data collection. So if you're going to compare the average score of these teens on this leadership skill measure as compared to what they were before, obviously that means that you need some sort of post-test design, a pre-post design. Now this question does not require, based on the way it's worded, does not require any comparison group, which would be a later life cycle phase of evaluation and the evaluation life cycle. It does not, there's nothing in the wording of this question that requires that you're causing, or that the program is directly responsible for the outcome in question. Those are later life cycle types of questions, which, let's see if we have that. Yeah, here we go. For example, does participation in this activity cause a change in leadership skills? So if you're going to talk about effectiveness or causation, there's actually a pretty significant hurdle to get over, which is you basically have to be doing a phase 3 or phase 4 life cycle evaluation, often using a quasi-experimental design, which was discussed in the text, or some other sort of control or comparison group, which can require a little bit more capacity and a little bit more resources, but it can allow you to make claims which are strong enough that they should be, generally published in a peer-reviewed journal, or win some awards for a poster as exemplary evaluation. People tend to like those types of evaluation because the claims you can make based on them are stronger, but sometimes it's just not feasible. And other times, remember, it's just not appropriate. It's not the best approach in all contexts. It's the best approach in one context, whereas in other contexts, like if you really want to focus on implementation, doing a qualitative study of how the program is being implemented would then be the most appropriate. So this little note here just touches on that same issue, that as you move through these questions, they're actually ratcheting up the level of, essentially the level of difficulty of the evaluation, and that also then has implications for feasibility. So this brings us to our activity for the week. You are going to, using the life cycle guide that I put up previously, and using your logic model, which I'll get you feedback on as soon as I can, and using your stakeholder analysis and your thinking through the different boundaries of your program, you're going to fill out this worksheet. I'll post the slide, but in worksheet form. And what you're going to be doing is coming up with candidate evaluation questions. So you identify some priorities in your logic, even if you don't have a pathway model, in your logic model. Choose an assumption or an activity or an outcome, or a linkage between an activity and an outcome, or a linkage between two outcomes. Any one of those elements from your model, choose it, and you're going to fill in the blank with that. And you could have 1 or 2 or 3, it depends. So say there's an assumption that people in my county are interested in financial literacy. And you've realized by doing your logic model that if that assumption doesn't hold true, then even if you implement your program as best as possible, high quality program, and even if you do a great evaluation, an outcome evaluation on what's going on in the program, if people are not interested, meaning if that assumption doesn't hold true, then the entire thing will be a failure. So maybe in walking through these different steps, thinking about stakeholders, purposes, logic model, you might have identified a killer assumption that you realize, boy, we really need to focus on this. So you would write down that assumption right here. Or maybe it's an outcome. Maybe it's, soybean farmers' knowledge of edge treatment for stink bugs. That's a particular construct. That's a thing. It's a one chunk of knowledge, and maybe you're interested in assessing all of the soybean farmers' knowledge on that outcome. You're not necessarily tying it to an activity. You just want to know what they know about this particular integrated pest management practice. So then that you would write down that outcome right here on the handout, and then based on that, there are different elements of your eventual evaluation plan which unfold from this whatever you choose to focus on. But before you get there, just reflect a little bit by either placing a check mark next to the item or adding in another reason as to why you chose that element. Maybe it's just important to you. I know a lot of you are realizing that, oh, evaluation is not just filling out the necessary reports to go to my administrators and my funders. Evaluation is fundamentally about finding something out, thinking critically, making program improvements. So there's a lot of reasons why you might choose to focus your evaluation on one component of your program or context versus another component. So this step 2 here just allows you to reflect a little bit on why you're choosing what you chose to focus your evaluation. Then, again, this is the part where it doesn't have to be real complicated, just for now. Just say in everyday language, like you were talking to someone, your buddy out on the street who never has gone to an evaluation class or done any research or evaluation or even done any education. If they say, "Oh, what are you thinking about right now?" You say, "Well, I'm thinking about finding out if my program, if my program helps people manage their money better." Is that what you want to know? If that's what you want to know, then you write it down in just plain English, and you jot down as many of those as you can, but focusing on the main ones. You don't. Sometimes people end up wanting to know everything under the sun, and then that's just not feasible. So you can end up with maybe 2 or 3 candidate questions here in your own words. Then, and there will be handouts to kind of guide you on this, based on the purposes of the evaluation, based on the design implications. For instance, are you going to be asking a question that would require a pre-test, post-test design, or one that would require only, say, a process evaluation? Is it a question that would somehow require a developmental evaluation, which was that other approach by Michael Patton that's been discussed before but was mentioned in the textbook this week? So the formatting is going to be a little tricky because it's kind of like speaking a different language and learning the grammar of that language, figuring out what parts of the sentence go where and whatnot. But just try to use the handouts, use the textbook. One nice thing about the textbook in chapter 8 and I think into 9, there were over 100 example evaluation questions presented along the way in little bullet points. You can look at those, look at the way they're worded, but try to think critically about what the implications are for the way they're worded. So if the question has anything to do with change, you're going to need more than one time point in your data collection, right? Because otherwise, if you just take a snapshot in time, a cross-sectional survey, for instance, you have no strong evidence about how things have changed over time. So the wording of the question matters. That's what this is all about at this point. Then, because I think all of us agree that it's pretty important to keep utilization and usefulness in mind, now that you've gone through this exercise, just quickly reflect on sort of, if you were able to answer this evaluation question with good data, what would that let you do? Who would that help? Who would that serve? Who would benefit from that? What if your evaluation, by answering your evaluation question, you find out that your program is not effective? What does that do for you? What are you going to do with that information? So that's section 5. You just describe that kind of briefly. So that's, we're not going to necessarily discuss, but you will practice this week in the assignment. There will be no forum section for this week, just to give you guys a little break. But I want you to really focus your time and energy on getting some good evaluation question drafts. It doesn't have to be final, and you could have 1 or 2 or 3. I'd say, again, depending on how detailed they are. If they're pretty detailed, you could maybe have 5 or so. You don't want to have 5 huge, earth-shattering, overarching questions. If you're having really, really broad questions, maybe you just need 1. Because remember, any construct or key idea in your question, you're going to have to operationalize. You're going to have to define that construct before you make any decisions about how you're going to collect data and whether that should be qualitative data, quantitative data, mixed methods, what have you. So this is important. So if you want, you can always use the forum section and start a thread and discuss what's going on with your colleagues. But the main goal, in addition to doing the readings, which are focusing on data collection for this next coming week, and doing the critical reading response, is to really use the other resource handouts, which will be posted along with the module, and really come up with just as good as you can, some draft evaluation questions, and then submit that through the assignment section. So thanks again for all of your great work. I'm very much looking forward to the evaluation questions that you come up with. And really know that, like I said, this will be an iterative process. You probably won't get it right at first pass. I'll provide some feedback, and we can keep tweaking it from there as we all help each other try to do better evaluation.